January 13th, 2002, a 42-year-old man named Ronald Huff walked in the door of his studio apartment in the city of Newark, Delaware. He had just come back from visiting his grandmother, and now he was feeling really sick. He walked over to the kitchen counter, and he reached into a jar, and he pulled out a whole fistful of live cockroaches. They were about 2 inches long each, and they wriggled around inside of his hand. He threw the cockroaches onto the ground, and then watched as they scattered. Now that Ronald's chores were finished, he decided he would just go lay down. But as he walked across the kitchen towards his bedroom, that dizziness he was feeling earlier came back. And suddenly it was like the whole world was spinning around him. And so he turned his body around and pressed his back up against the door to steady himself. But he was just so woozy and weak that eventually he just kind of slouched down to the ground, back against the door, feet out in front of him. Slowly, he let his eyes close. As Ronald passed out, all he could hear were the sounds of roaches scurrying and chicken bones crunching. 3 days later, Ronald's neighbor heard the crackle of police walkie-talkies out in the hallway. He opened his door and he saw 2 police officers and the superintendent of their building standing in front of Ronald's door. The neighbor watched as the officers stuck their heads into the apartment and then jumped back with their hands on their guns. Then one of the cops grabbed their radio and began frantically talking into it, and then the neighbor watched as the officers and the superintendent quickly walked down the hallway out of sight, leaving Ronald's apartment door partially open. And as the neighbor heard the sound of sirens wailing outside, he took a cautious step into the hallway and realized he could actually see into Ronald's apartment through the open door. And what he saw inside of there was so horrifying that for a second, the neighbor just froze. And then a second later, he backed into his own apartment and slammed the door behind him. Hours later, this neighbor could not get the image of what he had seen in Ronald's apartment out of his head. So he grabbed a piece of paper and just began sketching the bizarre scene. It would turn out Ronald had a secret. And on the evening of January 13th, 2002, that secret killed him. Here is the picture that the neighbor drew of what he saw inside of Ronald's apartment. On the floor is Ronald's dead body. His face, his ears, his hands, and his internal organs had all been eaten. And surrounding Ronald were the giant monitor lizards that he was secretly keeping as pets. He had 7 of them, which he fed roaches and raw chicken and allowed to just free roam his apartment. They ranged in size from 2 feet to 6 feet long. Now, it's assumed he died from the staph infection and then was consumed. However, the autopsy couldn't prove that, and so it is possible he may have been still alive when they began to eat him. After Robert's death, his lizards were taken from his apartment and placed in the Catoctin Wildlife Preserve and Zoo in Thurmont, Maryland.